Well, we're getting close to ending the book of Nehemiah. We ended last week with chapter 9, and I want to begin by reading the last verse of chapter 9 because that is kind of the introduction to chapter 10. So Nehemiah chapter 9 verse 38 says, "And because of all this, we make a sure covenant and write it. Our leaders, our Levites, and our priests seal it." So that's where we ended up last week, was the people agreeing to make this covenant, to secure it, to seal it, to sign it, basically saying we are resolved to keep this covenant, this contract or agreement with God, and to follow it. And not only the people, but the leaders, the Levites, the priests, everybody. Everybody agreed to keep it. So then chapter 10 is kind of an illustration. It shows the resolve of the people and what they agreed to do to keep the covenant. So that's what chapter 10 is all about. It is about the people and what they agreed to do. There are probably 100 names in this chapter, none of which I know how to pronounce. And so we will just assume that everybody knows who these people are. Every once in a while there's a name that we know, like Jeremiah, for instance. But what's important, of course, is that this shows the leaders and the fact that, the heads of houses were the ones that signed and sealed the covenant and agreed that this is what we're going to do. We're going to do it. So, he begins in chapter 10, verse 1. Now, those who place their seal on the document. All right, of course, the document's talking about the covenant. So this covenant wasn't just an oral agreement. This was a written document that people signed and sealed. And of course, back at that time, there was at least two different ways of sealing official papers. One was the imprint of your thumbnail. That was one way of doing it. Another way was each person had or leader had a private seal, and they would put it on press it into a ball of moist clay, and then it would, harden, and they would put a string around the document. So both of those ways were ways of showing that the people agreed to do this. The very first person on the list was Nehemiah. All right? He was the governor. He was the leader of them. And remember, he was employed by the Persian government. He was employed by Artaxerxes, the king. And so he begins, there's a list there. In these verses, he talks about the various ones in verse 2, like Azariah and Jeremiah, Sariah, and goes all the way down to verse 8. And he says, these were the priests. So after Nehemiah being the governor, and then we have a whole list, I didn't count them, but there's a number of priests who sign it. I don't know. I think there's 20-some priests. Well, then we have the Levites. And of course, remember, the Levites were the group that did a lot of the service in the temple as far as, physically keeping it up and that type of thing. He begins with Jeshua, all right, who we've heard about. And then he talks about their brethren, the various ones. It goes through verse 13. So there were a number of Levites that signed the document. And these were possibly heads of their families. That seems like a logical conclusion, that they were heads of the family. So we started with Nehemiah the governor. We went to the priest who actually did the sacrifices. Then we went to the Levites. And now in verse 14, he talks about the leaders of the people, or the heads of the families. And these would have been non-Levites. Okay, so he's talked about the priests and the Levites, so now these are going to be non-Levites that he mentions. And he begins in those, in verse 10, and goes all the way down to verse 27. And so there are a number of people that he lists that were heads of their families, chiefs of their families. And so these were the people that signed the agreement for the heads of their families and the heads of their groups. Priests, Levites, non-Levites, all of these people. Well, now we get to the rest of the people. So, verse 28, now the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the Nethinim, and remember we've talked about all of those being involved in the past several weeks, and all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone who had knowledge and understanding. And notice verse 29. These, all right, those people he just mentioned, joined with their brethren, the nobles, and entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and his ordinances and his statutes. All right. Again, this shows the resolve of the people. They had just found out that they had not been observing the Feast of Tabernacles, Booths, and they observed that, remember, for a whole week. And Ezra, remember, read the law every day during that for several hours. And so the people are being reminded of all of these things, many of which they had, stopped doing or failed to do. And so they're being reminded of all of God's laws and what he wanted them to do and how he wanted them to live. And one of the things they did in verse 28, which is really an important point, especially considering what's going to happen in the next couple of chapters, and it talks about all those who had separated themselves from the peoples of the lands, all right, from the peoples of the lands to the law of God. See, they were, this goes all the way back to the days of Moses, they were not to have, they were not to be a part of any of the other groups there at all. So, let's go back first of all to Exodus. Go back to Exodus chapter 34. Exodus 34. And I'm going to read beginning in verse 14. All right? Exodus 34 verse 14 says, "For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods, and make sacrifices to their gods, and one of them invites you, and you eat of his sacrifice. And you take of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods. You shall make no molded gods for yourselves." See, this was telling them that they cannot, all right, they cannot go in and have relationships with the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites. They cannot do it. And then notice, along with that, Deuteronomy chapter 7. Remember, this is like the retelling of the law before they go into the land. Deuteronomy 7, if I can get to it, verse 3. Deuteronomy 7 verse 3 says, "Nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughter to their son, nor take their daughter to your son." This goes back to verse 1 of Deuteronomy 7 that says, When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. So they were not to make any covenant with them, nor were any of them to marry any of these people. They weren't to intermarry with any of these groups in Canaan. Now remember, back in Ezra's time previously, in Ezra chapter 9 and 10, some of the people had done that, chapters 9 and 10 of Ezra. So, and so he came out and straightened the matter out. Well, now, several years later, we have this renewal, this covenant, and part of that covenant is that the people are reminded, you must separate yourself from these people. And he says to observe all what you do. Now, let's notice 30 and 31 because he adds some things there. We would not give our daughters as wives to the peoples of the land, nor take their daughters for our sons. If the peoples of the land brought wares or any grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath or on a holy day. And we would forego the 7th year's produce and the exacting of every debt. And again, this is a recounting of what the law of Moses had told them to do. So the people resolved not to buy any grain from foreigners on the Sabbath day. Now this seems to infer that other days of the week it was fine for them to do that, just not on the Sabbath day. In other words, they could have business dealings with them, but that was it. That's all they could have. See, the Sabbath day, of course, was a holy day. It was supposed to be a sacred day for them. Basically no work but rest and worship. And it says we would forego the 7th year's produce and the exacting of every debt. This was also part of the law of Moses. So they were to be released from their debts on the year of what is called Jehovah's released, if you go back to Deuteronomy 15. So they basically are saying, we're going to follow the law of Moses and we're going to do what he said. Well, he goes on, talks about some other things that they're to be doing. Verses 32 and 33. Also, we made ordinances for ourselves to exact from ourselves yearly 1/3 of a shekel for the service of the house of our God, for the showbread, for the regular grain offering, for the regular burnt offering of the Sabbaths, the new moons of the set feast, for the holy things, for the sin offerings to make atonement for Israel, and all the work of the house of our God. Now, if you go back to Exodus chapter 30, that price was half a shekel. Now, it's been revised to 1/3 of a shekel. I don't know why, but it was revised to just 1/3 of a shekel. And that was to pay for all the things that had to do with worshiping God. The showbread, that there was a table for it, the grain offerings and burnt offerings and for the set feast, and all the works of the house of our God. So that money was kind of like a tax that we paid for the government. And they paid that 1/3 of a shekel to provide for all of those things. You know, the Levites didn't have territory, or they didn't have any jobs where they could go out and make money. So they were basically paid by the people. And so this 1/3 of a shekel that the people paid was for the house of God. Was for all of these things that had to be done for the house of God. It had to be there were regular activities for it. All of those things that were necessary, daily offerings, yearly offerings, everything, all the feasts, that took basically money. And that's what this third of a shekel that they paid was to do. So he says in verse 34, we cast lots among the priests, the Levites, and the people for bringing the wood offering into the house of our God according to our fathers' houses at the appointed times year by year to burn on the altar of the Lord our God as it is written in the law. And we made ordinances to bring the first fruits of our ground and the first fruits of all fruit of all trees year by year to the house of the Lord, to bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle, as it is written in the law, and the firstborn of our herds and our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who minister in the house of our God. So again, these are things that were in the law of Moses. These, the first fruits, the people were to bring the first fruits basically of everything. Whether it was animals or plants or whatever, they were to bring the first fruits of all of it to the house of God. And again, this was for the priests because they didn't raise cattle. They didn't raise any sort of grains or plants. They were strictly there for the service of the temple. And so they had to have something that provided for them. And that was what the third of a shekel was, and that's what all these first fruits was for the priests, for the people of God. It says, let's see, one of it said, to burn on the altar for the Lord our God. That one altar was supposed to burn continually. 24 hours a day, is never to go out. So again, that was something that the priesthood had to take care of. And so people were to bring wood for that because it had to burn all the time. Even their sons were brought, and of course that meant they were brought to be sanctified. The firstborn son was sanctified, set apart, because he was the firstborn son. So the people are being kind of retold all of these things, and apparently they hadn't done a lot of them for some time. And so they're saying, we're going to start doing all of these things now. All the things we hadn't done, we're going to do. And that's what they're getting ready to do. And so, beginning in verse 37 through the end of the chapter, this is what they do. So, to bring the first fruits of our dough, our offerings, the fruit from all kinds of trees, the new wine and oil, to the priest, to the storerooms of the house of our God. And so there were rooms there where this was stored until they needed it. And to bring the tithes of our land to the Levites, for the Levites should receive the tithes in all of our farming communities. Again, because the Levites couldn't work or didn't have land, so the people would bring that tithe of their land to the Levites. That's essentially how they were paid. That's how they were supported. And this is talked about back in Numbers as well, Numbers chapter 4. So, and then lastly, for the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the offering of the grain, of the new wine and the oil, to the storerooms where the articles of the sanctuary are, where the priests who minister and the gatekeepers and the singers are, and we will not neglect the house of our God. See, there's the resolve. We will not neglect the house of our God. That is going to be a priority. And of course, that principle hadn't changed. We're still to give the best we have. And I'm not just talking about money here, but this is the best of our time, the best of our abilities, the best of our energy, the best of our efforts. Just the best. That's what God wants. So our worship and our daily lives, everything. And so that's what these people resolved that they were going to do. They were not going to neglect their duties. And of course that last statement is really what chapter 10 is all about. We're going to do what we need to do. And then one of the things that needs to be done is Jerusalem. They've rebuilt the walls, the temple's rebuilt, the gates are rebuilt, but there's not enough people living in Jerusalem. Most people are living outside Jerusalem. And a lot of the Jewish people may not have wanted to live in Jerusalem. Bad memories. Some people have a hard time going to funerals, to places there and the funeral parlor, because it brings back bad memories. Well, for many of these Jewish people, Jerusalem brought back bad memories. Their grandfathers or so forth, their places were destroyed years ago. And so they may have bad memories. So a lot of people are not living in Jerusalem. So in chapter 11, we see what they're going to do about it. So chapter 11 verse 1 says, "Now the leaders of the people dwelt at Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to dwell in Jerusalem. The holy city and 9/10 were to dwell in other cities. And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered themselves to dwell at Jerusalem." See, it sounds like nobody really wanted to live in Jerusalem. They just didn't want to. So there were two things they did. Some people voluntarily said, okay, we'll go back and build our houses and live in Jerusalem. And it says the people blessed all of those who chose to do that. They volunteered to go live in Jerusalem. The rest of the people, there was basically a lottery. And 1 out of every 10, whether you consider it won the lottery or lost the lottery, had to go live in Jerusalem. So 1 out of 10. The other 90% could go dwell outside Jerusalem, live in their own cities, wherever it was. So 10% of the people that were chosen by lots dwelt in Jerusalem. So this was God's plan to repopulate Jerusalem, because it needed to be repopulated. I mean, this was the capital, if you will. This was where the temple was. This was where God's presence was represented. So, it seems like there was this stigma about not wanting to be in Jerusalem. Again, it may have been because of bad feelings that people had. So, verse 3 says, "These are the heads of the province who dwelt in Jerusalem. But in the cities of Judah, everyone dwelt in his own possession in their cities. Israelites, priests, Levites, Nethinim, and descendants of Solomon's servants." Same groups that we've heard about for several weeks. "Also in Jerusalem dwelt some of the children of Judah and of the children of Benjamin." Okay, of course, those were the two southern tribes. And so he mentions the children of Judah. He mentions a number of people in verses 4 and 5 that dwelt in Jerusalem. So these were some of the people, residents of the tribes of Judah, residents of the tribe of Benjamin. In verse 6, all the sons of Perez who dwelt in Jerusalem were. And he says there were 468 valiant men who were of the tribe of Benjamin, and in particular, from Perez. I'm sorry, that was Judah, that was Perez. And then Benjamin, there was 928. So there were 468 from Judah and 928 from Benjamin. People from those two tribes who lived there. Now notice, let's see, Joel, verse 9, was their overseer. And Judah, the son of Sanua, was second over the city. These seem to be like the city manager and the assistant city manager were these two people. And so one assisted the other. And then he mentions in verse 11 some others. Verse 12, their brethren who did the work of the house. He mentions these people. Verse 13, and his brethren, heads of the fathers' houses, were 242. He mentions some of their people. Verse 14, and their brethren, mighty men of valor, were 128. And it talks about their overseers. Verse 15, Levites. He mentions those Levites who were living in Jerusalem and who they were. Verse 16 says, this one had the oversight of the business outside of the house of God. Then verse 17 mentions the leader who began the thanksgiving with prayer. Verse 18 says, all the Levites in the holy city were 284. Then he talks about the gatekeepers. Verse 19, 172. Verse 20, and the rest of Israel, of the priests and Levites, were in all the cities of Judah, every one in his inheritance. In other words, where they came from. Came from Bethlehem, they came from here, they came from there. And then it says, verse 21, the Nethinim dwelt in Ophel. And then it mentions the two people who were over the Nethinim. And it seems like these were like the servants of the servants, kind of like the ones who did some of the grunt work. And then verse 22, the overseer of the Levites at Jerusalem, he mentions him. And the singers in charge of the service of the house of God. Now, notice verse 23. For it was the king's command, this is Artaxerxes, concerning them that a certain portion should be for the singers, a quota day by day. So the singers were to be paid according to the king's command, King Artaxerxes. So a portion was to be given to them, a share, if you will. And then it mentions Pethahiah of the son of Judah was the king's deputy in all matters concerning the people. And so Artaxerxes had a worker there whose job, I guess if you want to call it that, was to make sure this was all done. In other words, he was in all matters concerning the people. So he had a job from Artaxerxes, and I assume he reported to Artaxerxes. He informed him about whether this was being done or not. And his name was Pethahiah. And then he ends with verse 25 and on. And as for the villages with their fields, some of the children of Judah dwelt in these villages. And he talks about various places. And then in verse 30 he talks about they dwelt from Beersheba to the valley of Hinnom. And then he talks about children of Benjamin dwelt in these cities and villages. And then it ends up with some of the Judean divisions of Levites were in Benjamin. So he talks about the towns in Judah and Benjamin that were occupied. So that's where the people went. That was where that 90% went that didn't live in Jerusalem. They went to those towns in Judah and Benjamin, and that's where they began to live. And, I think if we were to narrow down chapters 10 and 11 to one word, it would be resolve. the people resolved to do what they heard from Ezra, from the reading of the law. They resolved they were going to do it. They made a commitment. And a lot of people don't have any idea what commitment's about nowadays. But these people, at that time anyway, were saying, we're going to do it. We're going to do what we can to follow this. We're going to tithe. We're going to bring the first fruits. We're going to pay the third of a shekel. We're going to observe the feast. We're going to do all of these things. And again, I think that's what I think one word sums it up. They had good intentions. Did they keep them? No. But at this point in Nehemiah, the people are saying, we're resolved. We sing that song, I am resolved. And that's what the people were saying. I am resolved. And no doubt many of them did. But they had good intentions. No doubt at this point in these two chapters. They had good intentions. And we'll see, especially in chapter 13, where those good intentions fell by the wayside. That's kind of how Nehemiah is going to, not exactly end, but we're going to see that's what happens to the people. Okay, well, thank you very much, and went through a lot. I would be here another hour if I tried to pronounce all the words and people's names that we skipped, but we understand what those principles were that we're trying to learn from it. And so next week, hopefully, we'll look at Nehemiah chapter 12. It talks a lot about the priests and the Levites and the dedication of the wall there in Jerusalem.